Hello. Last time we looked at Is Just a Thought in part one. We looked at how the idea or impression of the outside world comes through our natural senses, our sense organs, and is formulated within the brain as an event. This event could be considered to be in the form of the actual item being observed. So, for instance, we could say that here we've formed a little idea of a tree. And the fact that we form such mental events means that we're able to recognize that event is related to that event outside. So effectively, whatever is the outside world, we're taking that in, we're formulating an event in our mind. However you want to represent that in the physical world, it can be seen as electrical impulses if you put it on a chart, for example. And the fact that it's there, that is the reality that we see. Because there is no other real world for us. The only real world for us is the one that we have in our mind. And in fact, what is happening is that we form an impression and effectively project that impression into a three-dimensional space that we call reality. If I asked you, for instance, to close your eyes and think of a tree, you'd be able to do so. There isn't a tree out there, but there is clearly a tree inside your mind. And the very fact that it's in your mind and not out there means it's imagination. So in both cases, to see a tree, whether a physical tree or an imaginary tree, this event has to be in the mind. Further, we went on to say that this analysis of this mental event is performed by four aspects of the mind. The first is the what is confusingly called the mind, which is actually taking that input form from the eyes, the optic nerve and the visual cortex to figure out what the image might be. From memory you evaluate, that's a tree because I know trees from my past. Notice you actually can't detect things, you can't know about things that you don't already know about. So we need to draw out of memory this is a tree so that we can correlate what is coming in through the senses to what we know is a tree to say it's the tree. Intellect takes the decision, is definitely a tree, and the ego takes ownership of that decision. If necessary, it says that's my tree or I like that tree. It takes it all into personal aspect. And we said that that ego is so strong with his doership, with his sense of I, that it takes over your entire mind and body and says that this is me. And everything else is subservient to this me because I am doing the seeing, I am doing the thinking, the feeling, all types of perceptions and emotions. So the ego takes control, and that control is complete. It takes control over the entire body so that the ego says, this is the real I. Now, let's see how this works in practice, and we'll be able to figure out how seeing something or hearing something affects us. So in this example, I'm going to choose, there's somebody out here, somebody you may know or not know, it really doesn't matter, and they decide to say something, all right? And they say, idle. And you hear this idle, this word idle, and this goes in and it forms an idle impression in your mind. So the mind has picked up these sensory inputs from the ears and it's From memories figured out, idle is an English word. It understands what idle is. So now it has comprehension of knowledge. The intellect looks at that data and said, that's definitely idle. And the ego says, that's a derogatory term. He's saying, this person is saying, I'm lazy. And the ego, suddenly, ego's output is, how dare they? How dare they say that I'm idle? All right? And that impression that's formed immediately raises a response. And what it typically does, it raises anger. And when you're in anger, you're no longer thinking rationally. You're way past thinking rationally. Now anger has taken over the mind, and the anger will release adrenaline. If I can spell adrenaline, I think that's right. Adrenaline. And adrenaline, what will that do? That will increase, it's the fight or flight. So in this case, it'll be the fight. How dare they call me idle? So the adrenaline fires up and your body starts increasing its heart rate, starts increasing the breathing rate, the muscles tense up, ready to do the fight. And what is the result? You suffer. You suffer not only in terms of having a bad thought, thinking that you've just been abused by somebody, talking from the outside world and calling you idle. So you've got some mental attitude. You're suffering mentally, but you're also suffering physically. Because this adrenaline has increased the heart rate. And it's increased breathing. At its final level, these could be enough to trigger some third function, like a stroke or a heart attack. So, you suffer. You suffer directly as a result of the way that it's been analyzed by the mind, evaluated by the memory, firmed upon that it's an idol, it's an abusive term, and the ego says, how dare they say that to me? And you trigger a whole series of functions, possibly resulting in some sort of heart attack. Who did that? Did the word idle coming into your ears have the power to create a heart attack? No. The only person who has created that heart attack is you. In the way that you've taken that word and given it a meaning, given it a representative, given it an association with me, with I, the ego. And therefore this is known as subjective thinking. Subjective thinking, because this thinking is associated with the subject, with me, with I. Now, what's the alternative to this? There is an alternative. And the alternative is to say, why did they call me idle? All right? It's not saying, how dare they, because you've immediately taken it on yourself. It's you don't understand why somebody would say idle. And maybe then that person responds to say, I said, idol, i.e. somebody that's looked up to, looking great, is a representation of what should be. So you actually misheard what was said. Mishearing that leads to a heart attack that you create as a result of subjective thinking. There is a way of looking at it differently to say, I'm not going to relate that word to me. And this is a very important aspect. When we react against something that is said or heard or seen, know that the only reason you react to it, that it raises an emotion within you, is that that is already inherent within you. If somebody says idle or idiot to you, and it raises an emotion, because in your subconscious you consider yourself to be idle or an idiot. If you didn't, the response would be, I wonder why they said that. The level of response that you get, the level of emotion that a certain word invokes, means how much you actually believe that about yourself. So remember, when you next react to someone, be very careful. What you're doing is bringing up from the subconscious something that you already believe about yourself. And the way to alleviate subjective thinking is no longer to believe that about yourself, no longer to have that in that memory, no longer have the ego relate that to the memory. What you need is, rather than subjective, taking an outside interpretation, relating it to yourself, you need to just take the outside interpretation for what it is. You need to accept what is coming in without relating it to yourself. And this is known as objective thinking. You just relate to the thought that comes in, the waveform in your mind. You relate to it and say, I understand what it is, but I'm not going to relate it to me, because there is no truth in that. I don't believe that I'm idle or an idiot, and therefore it can't possibly be true. If somebody says an idiot to me, and I know that I'm not an idiot, I'm going to say, oh, how terribly sad. How much suffering has somebody got in their mind to say an idiot to somebody else who is clearly not an idiot? And then you have compassion towards that person. And compassion is the opposite of a heart attack. You feel good. You feel relaxed within yourself. So the way that you interpret information when it comes to you, you can either relate it to yourself, be subjective and react, or you can take the information for what it is and be objective and be compassionate. It's your choice. It doesn't depend on the other person. That was merely the trigger, the first item in a long sequence of thinking that you performed in your own mind. They didn't perform it. They didn't release the adrenaline. You did. And you did it through your thinking process. So you now need to change your thinking process. If you'd like an example to remember this by, imagine that you've got a fairly heavy box full of lots of little bits and pieces. You're walking down the pavement. You can't actually see very well in front of you, but you're walking down and you're going to put it down in your car. And somebody bumps into you, and the box goes flying everywhere, and all the little pieces are all over the pavement. And your first temptation is to shout, "What the hell, didn't you see me coming down the road like this with the heavy box? Why bump into me, of all places? Now look at what you've done." That's what you would normally say. And just about when you're about to open your mouth, you turn around and you see a little white stick, and you see that the carrier of the stick is a blind man. They'd bumped into you, as a blind person might do. It wasn't their fault. And what do? All of your hatred, your heart beating, your aggression turns into compassion for the blindness of the person. Now you understand the situation. You understand why the event happened. And suddenly you are an objective thinker. And when you are thinking objectively, you do not suffer. So, events will happen. People will call bad names. People will bump into you. Things will happen in the world, right? But suffering is not compulsory. Suffering is something that you choose to do. Objective thinking allows you to make that choice and be much more rational about the world around you. This takes some practice. And in the next video, we'll discuss how we may be able to perform objective thinking more often.